Myth number 3, confidence means certainty. This is the one that does the most damage because true confidence is the willingness to act without full certainty. That's a completely different psychological posture than the one most people mean when they think of confidence. When most people say someone's confident, they mean that person looks like they know what's going to happen. But the people who actually perform at the highest levels under the most complex conditions, they're not certain. They've just developed the capacity to move forward without certainty.
Welcome to Beyond Success, the podcast for high achievers seeking deeper meaning, fulfillment, and purpose. Now, here's your host, world-renowned leadership coach and therapist, David Tian, PhD.
Here's a question I want you to sit with for a moment. What if the thing holding you back isn't a lack of knowledge or strategy or discipline, but instead an inability to sit still with a question that has no clear answer? That's what this episode's about. I'm going to identify a specific capacity that separates merely competent leaders from the ones who build something lasting. And I'll tell you right now, it's not intelligence, it's not work ethic, it's not vision or grit or any of the other words people put on motivational posters. It's something most high performers have spent their entire careers trying to avoid. So why does this matter so much? And why do most people miss it? Here's why. Most ambitious people built their success on a specific skill: eliminating uncertainty. They got good at finding the right answer faster than anyone else. School rewarded that. Early career rewarded that. You raise your hand first, you get the promotion, you close the deal, you solve the problem before anyone else even finishes reading it. And that approach worked. And it worked until it hit its limits. And you hit that limit when you reach a certain level of success, when the stakes get high enough that uncertainty becomes permanent. Running a company, leading through ambiguity, making decisions where no amount of analysis itself will produce a clear answer. Not because you haven't done enough research, but because the situation actually doesn't have a knowable outcome yet. And then suddenly, the skill that got you to this point, collapsing uncertainty into certainty as fast as possible, now becomes the thing that actually holds you back. There's almost something comedic about it if you step back far enough. Like the harder you grip, the less you can hold. The more desperately you need the answer, the further it moves from you. The mind that was trained to solve everything meets a problem it cannot solve by the standard methods of solving. And then it panics. It's like watching a master locksmith try to pick a lock that doesn't have a keyhole. He's not lacking skill. He's applying the wrong category of effort entirely. Now, before we go any further, I want to point out 3 myths that keep smart people stuck here. Because these myths might sound like wisdom to us because they get repeated in business books and leadership seminars, but they're either wrong or they're incomplete in ways that really matter. Okay, the first myth is, great leaders are decisive. Of course they are. I'm not arguing against decisiveness, but decisiveness built on an intolerance for uncertainty isn't good leadership. Instead, it's anxiety dressed up in a suit. There's a real difference between making a clear decision under ambiguity and making a premature decision to escape the feeling of ambiguity. From the outside, those two things might look the same, but from the inside, the leader always knows which one it was. You always know whether you decided because the moment was right or because you couldn't stand the discomfort of waiting one more day. Myth number 2, more information leads to better decisions. Sometimes it does, and early on in a decision process, more information is usually useful. But past a certain threshold, gathering more information becomes a way to avoid deciding. It looks like diligence. It might feel like rigor, but it actually functions as avoidance. You're not researching because you need more data. You're researching because deciding means stepping into the unknown, and you'd rather stay in the risk-free library. Myth number 3, confidence means certainty. This is the one that does the most damage because true confidence is the willingness to act without full certainty. That's a completely different psychological posture than the one most people mean when they think of confidence. When most people say someone's confident, they mean that person looks like they know what's going to happen. But the people who actually perform at the highest levels under the most complex conditions, they're not certain. They've just developed the capacity to move forward without certainty. And that capacity, that specific internal ability, is what we're going to unpack for the rest of this episode. So let's talk about where this comes from, because nobody's born with low tolerance for uncertainty. Instead, it's built, cultivated, it's conditioned. And for most high performers, it was built early. Here's the developmental arc. Most high achievers discovered as children that intelligence was their way out of vulnerability. If you could figure things out, you were safe. If you had the answer, you had control. If you had control, nobody could hurt you. Maybe that meant academic performance. Maybe it meant reading the emotional temperature of a room before anyone else. Maybe it meant becoming the kid who always had a plan. The specifics vary, but the structure is the same. Intelligence becomes armor. And this pattern works for a while. It works so well that by the time you're running a team or a company, you don't even see it as a pattern anymore. It's invisible to you. You don't experience it as a strategy that you adopted at age 8. Instead, you experience it as who you are. Like, I'm the person who figures things out. It's not a description of a skill. That's actually an identity. And when your identity is built around having answers, the absence of answers doesn't feel like a gap in information. Instead, it feels like a threat to your sense of self. The best strategists in the world will tell you the same thing. The hardest brief isn't the one with too little information. It's the one where the answer genuinely doesn't exist yet, and the client wants it by Tuesday. Any competent person can synthesize data. The real discipline is staying with the problem long enough for the true answer to emerge, instead of grabbing the first plausible answer in order to relieve the pressure. That restraint, the willingness to not know for longer than is comfortable, is actually rare. And it's rare specifically because it goes against everything achievers were trained to do. Now let's get even more practical. When uncertainty tolerance is low, it shows up in predictable ways. And I want to walk through these carefully with you because the whole point is that these behaviors don't look like fear. Instead, they look like competence. And this makes it really hard for us to catch these. Okay, the first is over-control. You start managing details that aren't actually yours to manage, not because those details need your attention, but because controlling small things gives you a hit of certainty when the big things feel too uncomfortable or uncontrollable. So you reorganize your desk when your business model is in question, or you obsess over the font on a slide deck when the strategy behind it is actually unclear to you. The small domain you can master becomes a refuge from the larger domain that you can't. The second is micromanagement, which is a specific form of over-control directed at people. You don't trust the process because you can't tolerate not knowing the outcome, so you hover. You check in too often. You edit work that actually doesn't need editing. Your team actually reads this as distrust. And they're right, it is distrust, but the person you actually distrust most is yourself. You don't trust your own ability to handle whatever happens if you let go, so you never let go. The third is system building as avoidance. This one is especially invisible because it looks like good leadership. You create elaborate frameworks, processes, dashboards, tracking systems, not because the situation requires that level of structure, but because the structure itself soothes the anxiety. The system becomes a container for the feeling rather than a tool for the work. So you're not organizing the chaos, you're organizing your fear of the chaos. The fourth is analysis paralysis dressed up as thoroughness. So you keep researching, you keep modeling scenarios, you keep asking for one more data point. And here's a big tell. Pay attention to this. If the additional information wouldn't actually change your decision, then you're not actually being thorough. You're hiding. You already know enough to act. You're just not willing to act without the feeling of certainty. And no amount of data will give you that feeling because the situation is genuinely uncertain. Now, I want to bring in a framework that ties all of this together. Wilfred Bion, B-I-O-N, was a famous psychoanalyst who studied group dynamics and leadership, and he used a phrase that I find remarkably useful: capacity for containment. The idea is actually straightforward. A leader's job isn't to eliminate uncertainty for the group. Instead, it's to hold it, to metabolize the anxiety so the group can function well. Bion noticed something consistent. When the leader couldn't contain the uncertainty, then the group regressed. They stopped thinking clearly. They started looking for someone to blame, or someone to rescue them, or an enemy to fight. Not because the group members were weak, but because the container broke. The anxiety that the leader was supposed to hold ended up spilling out, and it had to go somewhere. This applies directly to teams, families, partnerships, any relationship where one person carries authority or influence. When you collapse into premature certainty, when you grab the first available answer because the not knowing state is unbearable, you're not just making a worse decision. You're signaling to everyone around you that uncertainty is somehow dangerous, that it's something to be eliminated as fast as possible, rather than carried and worked through. And the people around you end up adjusting to that signal. They stop bringing you ambiguous problems. They stop telling you things that don't have clean answers. They start performing certainty for you because they've learned that that's what you need. And now you're leading a group that actually can't think clearly, not because they lack the ability to do so, but because you've made it unsafe to not know. So what's actually happening beneath the surface when all of this is going on? So in addition to buy-in, I'm going to give you another framework that's really great for understanding this. In IFS therapy, internal family systems, the behaviors I just described have a specific name. The over-control, the micromanagement, the compulsive system building, the analysis paralysis. These aren't character flaws. They're protective strategies. Parts of your psychological system that took on specific roles a long time ago for very good, positive reasons back then. So here's how it works. Somewhere early in your life, you learned that not knowing was dangerous. Maybe it was a chaotic household where you couldn't predict what would happen next. Maybe it was a parent whose mood shifted without warning, and you had to read the room just to stay safe. Maybe it was the pressure of being the smart kid, the one everyone expected to have the answer, the one who got approval and belonging through competence. The specific origin varies from person to person, but the adaptation and the mechanism for this is the same. A part of you decided, not consciously, not deliberately, but decisively, that uncertainty equals threat. And that part built a system to eliminate uncertainty as fast as possible. And it had a positive intention when it did so. The thing that makes this so hard to work with is that those parts did their job. They kept you safe. They also made you successful. The kid who learned to figure things out before anyone else became the adult who rises through organizations. So the pattern itself isn't broken. It's working exactly as it was designed to do. The problem is that these parts can't tell the difference between, I don't know the answer to this math problem, versus, I can't predict whether this company will survive in the next 18 months. And then they apply the same strategy to both. And they collapse the uncertainty. Find the answer, restore control, even when the situation demands a completely different response. Patience, openness, the willingness to hold a question without forcing any resolution. Those parts fire up the old program because that's all they know how to do, and it worked back then. And this might be uncomfortable for intelligent people to hear, but you can't outthink this. You can't strategy your way out of it. Because the parts of you that want to eliminate uncertainty will try to eliminate the uncertainty about uncertainty. They'll try to build a system for tolerating ambiguity. They'll try to find the right framework, the right book, the right model, the perfect methodology for becoming comfortable with not knowing. And it will feel like progress. You'll feel like you're working on the problem. But it's actually the same pattern running, but one level up. The controller trying to control its own controlling. The solver trying to solve the problem of being too much of a solver. You haven't escaped the loop. You've just added another layer to it. Sometimes the real problem isn't more effort or more motivation. It's knowing the right direction. A lot of people listening to this podcast are capable and driven. Things still look fine on paper, but life still feels strangely flat. When that happens, more advice usually isn't the answer. Clarity is. I've put together a short assessment that takes about 2 minutes. It's simply a way to see which area deserves your attention most right now, whether that's relationships, decision-making, or how pressure is being handled day to day. Based on your responses, you'll be sent a short set of masterclasses related to that area. If that sounds useful, you can find it at dtphd.com/quiz. That's dtphd.com/quiz. So let's get more concrete here, because I've been talking about this pattern in conceptual terms, and I want to get specific about what it actually feels like in real time, in your physical body, because that's where you'll catch it first. Not in theory, but in the moment that is happening. So, what does low uncertainty tolerance actually feel like when you're in it? It'll feel like a tension, a tightness, a constriction in your chest or your throat, a pulling sensation toward resolution. Any resolution. You're in a meeting and someone raises a question with no clear answer, and you feel it immediately. Your chest tightens. Your mind starts racing toward a solution before you've even fully understood the problem. And then you hear yourself saying, "Here's what we'll do." And in that moment, if you're fully honest, you notice that the certainty in your voice doesn't match what you're actually feeling. You sound decisive maybe, but inside you're feeling more relieved. You found something to say, and then the pressure should drop. Or you're awake at 2 a.m, running scenarios, not productively, but compulsively. Your mind loops through possibilities, not to find the best path, but to find any path that makes this feeling stop. You're not actually problem solving, you're self-medicating with thought. Or you make a decision too fast, and you know it was too fast, and instead of reopening it, you double down. Because reopening it means admitting you don't know. And that admission, for reasons you can't quite articulate consciously, feels genuinely threatening. Not like intellectually threatening, more like threatening in your nervous system, like in your gut, the way a sudden noise in a dark room could feel threatening. Disproportionate to the actual situation, but absolutely real in that feeling in your body. Now, here's why this matters so much for high achievers especially. This is where people at the top face a special disadvantage that almost no one else talks about. The thing that made you successful, the ability to rapidly converge on answers, is the exact mechanism that now prevents you from developing tolerance for uncertainty and breaking through to the next level. You've been rewarded your whole life for collapsing ambiguity. Every promotion or every deal closed or every problem solved reinforce this pattern. You are, in a very real sense, professionally trained to do the opposite of what the hardest situations now require. It's like asking a champion sprinter to learn to stand still. Not just physically, but psychologically. The entire system is built for forward motion. Stillness could feel like death. But the situations that matter most at this higher level that you're operating at now, the ones with the highest consequences or the deepest complexity or the longest time horizons, those are precisely the situations that require the capacity that you've spent your whole career never developing. So to put it bluntly, the leader who cannot tolerate not knowing cannot think. They can compute, they can analyze, they can execute, like an AI. But genuine thinking, the kind that produces original insight, that holds contradictions long enough for something genuinely new to emerge, that requires a tolerance for the discomfort of the unknown. Without that tolerance, you're running sophisticated programs. You're not actually thinking. And I know this pattern because I've lived it. I want to be totally honest with you here because I've spent the last, 15 minutes describing something I didn't read about in a textbook. I described it because I watched myself do every single one of those things for years. For most of my life, up until about the last several years, my tolerance for uncertainty was, I would now say, looking back, quite low. Not non-existent, like I could handle moderate ambiguity, maybe even above average. I could navigate situations where the outcome was unclear, but the general direction was visible. But there were definite thresholds and limits. Invisible ceilings I couldn't push through. And the reason I couldn't push through wasn't a lack of talent or knowledge or desire. It was that pushing through meant stepping into a space where I genuinely did not know what danger was around the corner. And I was too afraid of that. And I couldn't yet tolerate that anxiety. In fact, I had no idea that tolerating that anxiety was something I was even supposed to work on. So I stayed too long in situations I had outgrown. I told myself I was being strategic, or I was being patient, or I was waiting for the right moment. But the truth is, I was waiting for certainty until it was obviously a sure thing. But that kind of certainty was not coming, because the next level never comes with certainty attached. I overprepared instead of taking action. I built more frameworks and systems when what was actually needed was a leap, a willingness to act before the picture was clear. I kept refining the plan instead of executing the plan I had, because refining felt productive and executing felt terrifying, like stepping into the unknown. And the part that may be hardest to admit, the breakthroughs in my life up to the past several years, the real ones, the ones that changed the trajectory of my life, almost none of them came from deliberate, comfortable choices. 3 decades of my life, up until maybe several years ago, the breakthroughs in my life came from crises, emergencies, situations where I was forced through the wall because, the wall was on fire. Not because I chose to walk through it. I didn't develop courage and then act. Something else blew up, and I had no option but to move. I had no choice. I was pushed through. The growth happened, but it happened against my will, and very late, and it was not because of my choice. And the fear of uncertainty made those crises worse, much worse, because when you've been avoiding the unknown, and then the unknown finally arrives uninvited, you don't meet it with any developed capacity. You meet it with all the accumulated dread of everything you've been refusing to face. The crisis itself might be manageable, like a business setback or a relationship rupture, a career transition. Difficult, absolutely, but survivable. What overwhelms you isn't the crisis itself. It's also the backlog. It's all the unfelt uncertainty that's been piling up behind the dam that you built to keep it out. And when the dam breaks, everything comes at once. I'd look at other people, other achievers who seem to take risks more easily, who could step into ambiguity without that same constriction in their chest. And I'd tell myself stories about them, like they were reckless, or they were lucky, or they were just wired differently. Some people are just built for risk, and I'm built for analysis. That's the kind of story I told myself. What I couldn't see, and looking back, what I didn't want to see, was that they had developed something that I had not. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to carry it. They felt the same discomfort. They just had a higher tolerance for it. And that tolerance gave them access to possibilities that I was cutting myself off from. So here's the principle, and I want to say it as plainly as possible. When you have a low tolerance for uncertainty, it isn't obvious. It doesn't show up in your life blowing a trumpet and wearing a bright red neon sign that says, "I'm the thing limiting you." Instead, it's dressed up as prudence or thoroughness or strategic thinking or high standards. Maybe it feels like intelligence. It might look to you like responsibility. Other people might even admire it. He's so careful, or she's so diligent. They really think things through. But what it actually does is it keeps you trapped at whatever level of complexity you can currently control. And that level is always smaller than what you are actually capable of. So the ceiling isn't your talent. The ceiling isn't opportunity. The ceiling is the amount of not knowing that you can tolerate. Everything else adjusts to fit inside that container. So let me pull this together. Here's what we've covered in this episode so far. The capacity that separates competent leaders from transformative ones isn't more intelligence or harder work. It's the ability to carry uncertainty without collapsing into premature certainty. The behaviors that reveal low tolerance of this, the overcontrol, the micromanagement, the compulsive system building, the analysis paralysis, those aren't character defects. Instead, they're protective strategies. Parts of your psychological system doing exactly what they were designed to do, which is eliminate the feeling of not knowing as fast as possible. And the reason this is so hard to change isn't a lack of willpower or self-awareness. It's that these strategies can't be out-thought. The thinking mind is the one running the protection, so you can't use the same machinery that created the problem to solve it. Now, I want you to sit with a question, and I mean actually sit with it, not race to an answer. Consider what's actually at stake here. Every decision you've made prematurely because you couldn't tolerate the discomfort of not knowing. What did that cost you? Not just in business outcomes, although of course that matters. Think about the deals you closed too early because you needed the certainty of a yes or a no more than you needed the right outcome. Think about the hires you made too fast because an open role might have felt like an open wound. But go beyond business. What did this pattern cost you in relationships? Relationships where you shut down complexity because it was easier to be certain than to stay curious and open. Relationships you ended prematurely, maybe, not because they were wrong, but because you couldn't stand the uncertainty that's intrinsic to caring deeply for another person. Because loving someone means not knowing what they'll do or what they'll feel or how they'll change. And if you can't tolerate that not knowing, you either control the relationship until it suffocates, or you leave before it can surprise you. Either way, you lose the thing you actually wanted. How many of the regrets you carry aren't really about making the wrong choice? Think about that honestly. How many of them are about making a choice before the real choice had time to reveal itself? You weren't wrong. You were early. And you were early because waiting felt too unbearable. And here's the harder question. If this pattern continues, if you keep building your life around the avoidance of not knowing, what does the next decade of your life look like? I think you already know. More of the same. More success within a shrinking perimeter. More control over less and less of what actually matters. A life that might look impressive from the outside, but feels increasingly constrained from the inside. Not because you lack ability, but because your ability exceeds the container that you've built for it, and you won't expand the container, because expanding it means tolerating the very thing you've organized your life to avoid. Because uncertainty is not going away. It's going to increase. The complexity of what you're trying to build, the depth of the relationships you want, the scale of the impact you're after, or the world we're all living in. All of it requires more tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty than you currently have. I'm not saying this as a criticism. It's a description of the growth edge. It's where the work is. But here's what becomes possible when that capacity actually develops. When you can hold uncertainty, not suppress it, not override it, not reframe it into false confidence, but genuinely carry it the way Bayan described. Metabolize it so that it doesn't spill out onto everyone close to you. The way you operate changes in concrete, visible ways. Like decisions get better, not because you suddenly have access to more information, but because you're no longer grabbing the first available answer. You're letting the situation teach you something before you respond. Your team starts thinking more clearly because you're no longer broadcasting anxiety disguised as urgency. They bring you harder problems. They tell you what they actually think instead of what they think you want to hear. Your relationships deepen because you can stay fully present with someone whose inner world you can't fully map and whose decisions you can't fully predict. And this is where intimacy actually lives. Not in certainty about the other person, but in the willingness to remain close without it. You stop needing to know in order to act. You start acting from a kind of clarity that includes not knowing. And that's a different posture entirely. It's not reckless. It's the opposite of reckless. It's the most grounded place you can operate from because you're no longer running from anything. Okay, so this is part one, clarifying the pattern in the cost. In the next episode, I'm going to go into what actually builds this capacity, not in the abstract, but the real developmental work that expands your tolerance for uncertainty from the inside out. That's coming next. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any comments whatsoever, I'd love to get your feedback. Leave a comment or send me a message. I'd love to hear it. If this has helped you in any way, please share it with anyone else who you think could benefit from it. Thank you again so much for listening. I look forward to welcoming you to the next episode. Until then, David Tian, signing out.